in a lot of years. So, you get the bulk of the contract, but the riders make up part of the contract too by definition. So it's important that you understand it. So let me just lay out for you what we're going to do. We've got a lot of ground to cover. You see the cover sheet with paragraph 19, and it's got all the addenda there. The highlighted ones are our goal to cover today. So we've got an aggressive amount of riders to cover, not a lot of time on each one. But what Amy and I are going to do is we are going to alternate, not exactly each every one, but we're going to go back and forth. One of us will take it to do the bulk of the explanation. The other, if they want to add something after the presenter is done, we'll do that. And then we'll open it up for questions on each individual rider. Okay, you ready to rock and roll? Let's go. Amy, condo.
We're going to start off with what I think is the most important rider, and that is the condo rider. Everyone wants to flip to that. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about the condo rider is you have to have it if your listing is a condo. If you forget about your condo rider, what happens day of closing? Buyer can say, change my mind. Doesn't have to be within any inspection period. Doesn't have to give any notice. It is voidable if you do not have this condo rider attached to your contract and provided to your buyer. Okay, that's how important it is. So first part of the condo rider, association approval. I don't know how many times I get a condo rider back and neither box is checked. And then we ask, is there approval? Oh, I don't know. Okay. So at that point, the closing agent is the one who reaches out, finds out if there's approval. But as a listing agent, as a selling agent, you guys should have this complete from top to bottom before you go under contract. So always find out if condo association approval is needed. You should also try and find out about how long the approval for this association takes. Are they extremely difficult? Does it take 3 to 4 weeks? Is there an interview part of the process? If so, don't schedule a closing 2 weeks out. Allow time for the process to go through. And then one other point about this, if your buyer, for whatever reason, is not approved, your buyer can terminate the contract and return their deposit. That does not mean your buyer cannot provide the association with the information they're asking. They have to use reasonable and diligent efforts to do that. But if they are not approved, they can terminate the contract and receive their deposit back. The next section is regarding right of first refusal. This means that the association could come in and say, you know what, we have a right of first refusal, meaning we want to buy the property from this seller. Sometimes this happens with older condos. It's not really built into condo documents anymore, but some of the older buildings have a right of first refusal. It's rare that an association might want the unit. I mean, why would they want to own a unit? But every now and again, they feel as though someone is getting a good price and they want to exercise their right of first refusal, which they're able to do. So know your associations, get this information in advance, because the further out you get it in advance, the less hiccups will be once you're under contract.
Get that from the association.
You can get that from the association, absolutely. Yep. Next couple sections are where you can really get in trouble. Fees and assessments. Should always know how much an assessment is charging or how much an association is charging for their assessments. You might have yearly assessments, you might have monthly assessments, you might have quarterly assessments, you might have all three. Always find that information out so that the buyer knows what they're getting into. The next section is even more important. So look at 3C, the dreaded special assessment. And I'm not somebody who really likes to read from paper when I do presentations, but I'm going to read this section. The seller represents that seller is not aware of any special or other assessment that has been levied by the association or that has been an item on the agenda or reported in the minutes of the association within 12 months prior to the effective date. So you have two different sections of assessments here. You have those that have been levied, those that are in place, and you have those that are pending, those that have been discussed at your association meetings. Now, what happens if your seller hasn't gone to any of the
Yeah,
meetings?
they
Does
can do
your, right, does your seller, are they imparted with having to find out this information? And the answer is yes. Have your seller request meeting minutes for the past 12 months and go through them. Go through them with your seller if you need to. Find out if there's been any discussion whatsoever about an assessment. Now, say that, 6 months ago, somebody brought up, hey, we might need to get our roof repaired. Do you put that on there? Has there been an assessment? Is it pending? It just depends on what's in the minutes. If they talk about levying or placing any type of a special assessment because of a repair, because of a budget shortfall, always list it. If you do not list it in there, there is no negotiation as to who pays. If you don't list it, the seller is on the hook. One other thing I want to point out is we talked about pending and we talked about levy. Assessments that are pending in the past 12 months, meaning they've shown up in your meeting minutes in the past 12 months, have to be listed. Assessments that have ever been levied and are unpaid have to be listed. Even if an assessment is from 4 years ago and your seller is making installments, that's not within the past 12 months, but it's already been levied. So you have to put it down. If it's not down, seller pays. Okay? Otherwise, you can negotiate any assessment under the sun, ask the buyer to pay some, seller to pay some, but if you leave it out, your seller is stuck paying the entire thing. Next section I want to skip to is section number 5, non-developer disclosure. This is the language that takes this condo rider and makes it compliant with Florida statutes. The first section seems to indicate that the buyer has already received the documents, but be careful. This doesn't only say the buyer's received the documents. It says the buyer's received the documents more than 3 days ago. And what that means is the buyer has had 3 days to review. And if there's anything in there in those documents that the buyer doesn't like, and you check that box, their time is passed to back out of the contract. The second box is the box that you're going to want to check if your buyer hasn't received the documents more than 3 days ago. And that's saying the buyer wants the documents, and as soon as he gets them, he has 3 days to review. Now, I want to point out what documents are required. Current copy of the declaration, articles of incorporation, bylaws and rules, and a copy of the most recent year-end financial information and frequently asked questions and answers. Anybody know what's not listed there that we just talked about? Minutes, meeting minutes. I always advise realtors to add in meeting minutes. You're not going to know what's been talked about in the meeting unless you look at the minutes. And the minutes are a lot of times hard to get. I have a lot of associations who have to scramble because, oh, well, we haven't typed up the past 3 months. Or, oh, we're waiting on so-and-so to do X, Y, and Z before we formalize it. So always get that in advance and always write in that you're requesting the minutes, because that way, if they can't get you the minutes right away, your time is told. You have until they get you all of the documents listed here, and then your 3 days start.
What if the seller listed them on the MLS, but you're the buyer's agent and you don't send the documents to your buyer? So the seller did what they were supposed to do, the seller agent. They put them up on MLS.
Well, as a buyer's agent, you shouldn't be allowing your client to sign this saying that they've received it unless you know that they've received it. Now, section 6, again, is whether your buyer's requesting or not requesting a copy of these documents. I don't think there is a reason in the world why you would not request these documents. Even if your buyer says, I've lived in 17 condos, I know what it's about, I don't need to look at them, always request.
Except if they own several properties in the same community.
There you go. There's the one reason. And then number 7, receipt of documents. Do not put a date in there unless your clients have received all the documents. And again, if you're writing meeting minutes in, Make sure they receive the meeting minutes before you write a date in there. It is okay to keep that blank. Your 3 days start when you receive all the documents. If you put a date in there, it means your 3-day clock has started ticking. And then finally, section 10, these are the new reports that everybody talks about, the milestone studies, the structural integrity reserve studies. A lot of condos don't have these yet. Some do, just depends. You should always ask for them, always take a look, see what they're showing, and review them with your client and make sure that they are comfortable with everything that's shown on these studies.
Done?
Done with my copyright.
Okay, let me just add a few more things based on some of the stuff that I know that's going on at the state level. I sit on the committee that's involved in writing this, and I will tell you, the condo rider is slated to be rewritten. There are multiple issues, multiple things that are challenging in here. But before I talk about a couple of those, I want to point out on page 2, between B and C, I'm finding this is not done. In big, bold, capital, not caps, in big, bold, if the property's part of an HOA, then you need to use the HOA disclosure, which I'm going to go over in a minute. We have many condominiums that reside within a master association that is an HOA. And in that case, you need not only the condo rider, but you need the HOA rider. And the fees that are part of the master go in the HOA rider, not in the condo rider. I see a lot of confusion about that, and people don't get it right. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time of emphasizing that. In many cases, you need both riders, condo and HOA. This whole notion of pending is something that only is found in the condo. It's not in the HOA. It's something the committee is looking at as to whether or not to get rid of that or to keep it. And the pending is based on 12 months of minutes and agendas. Under 5, well, actually, let me just go to 6 or 7 I want to hit. Only fill in 7 if you've given the documents and a complete set prior to by 3 days. So some people think that when they sign the contract and they give the documents to the buyer the day they're signing the contract, we check A, and you don't, because they have to have had them 3 business days prior to signing the contract. And if that's the case, then in 7, you can put the date that they received them. But otherwise, some people want to take this page after they give the condo docs to the buyer and have them fill this in. You don't do that. There is a separate document called receipt of documents. And you should be using the receipt of documents when you provide the documents to the buyer. They should be filling that out, not trying to come back and put a date into this part of this rider. 8 in the common elements. If there is a deeded boat slip, make sure the deeded boat slip is reflected in the legal description of the contract. But there are many condos that have right to use boat slips, garages, and whatever. And you want to indicate them if they are a right to use, that unit has the right to use it, indicate the garage number, the parking space, or if it's a boat slip, indicate that in there as well. You all are hopefully aware that the legislature is constantly changing the Condo Act. It was passed 2 years ago. Last year, we had what was called 2.0 fixes to the Condo Act. Now they're in 3.0 this legislative session. And so we are waiting to modify this rider until we get through this legislative session and until we see what comes out of this legislative session. And then this, in fact, will get a revision probably in the next year. So with that, let's hop to B, HOA Association. Yes.
Could I just ask a follow-on question? This lady over here mentioned about putting the condo docs on the MLS with the listing. Is that a good idea if you're the listing agent? Is there any reason why you should or shouldn't do that?
I don't think that's a bad idea. I can't imagine, anybody Unless you're going to, as a listing agent, think that that absolves you from
Right.
everything else, right? You want to put them out there for people to view before they make an offer, that's great. But that cannot be your sole responsibility. You cannot say, I'm putting it out there, now I'm done. It needs to be, and maybe the onus is on the buyer's agent, but someone needs to transmit them to the buyer who signs the contract.
And also, we are listings linger a little bit longer these days. Remember that there could be changes, anything was changed. So when you list them, it still would make sense to follow up to make sure there haven't been any changes. Example, I had one time, it didn't bug me, but I represented the buyer. They thought the property was rentable. Sometime between that time and closing, the HOA voted that it had to be owned for 2 years to rent.
Right.
It
Yep.
would have been a big mess.
And that's part of an HOA. Let me also say on condominiums, it's fine to post them in the MLS, but don't assume that that starts your 3-day clock when you go under contract. Your 3-day clock for the review will start when the buyer signs the receipt of document. Now, sometimes it may be an email that you send that the documents have been received, and that starts the clock. One of the big issues here with the clock starting is who received them. The contract, and this isn't the contract class, but in the contract, it says that an agent who receives documents is receiving them on behalf of their customer, and the clock would start then. And there's a debate that goes on. If the agent doesn't give the buyer the documents, did they waive or lose their 3-day right? I'm not here to answer that question. I'm here to tell you that as an agent, when you get condo docs, deliver them to your buyer immediately, have them sign a receipt of documents. That starts your clock and make sure everybody's on the same page.
And if the listing, or if the buyer's agent doesn't return a signed copy of the receipt, then when does the time start?
There's a lot of circumstances in that, but I would say if you are the listing agent and you email the documents and you have emailed a complete set of the documents, then you're going to rely on that email, the date and the time that you sent that.
Thank you.
But again, if you're using this condo writer, you're gonna fill in a document, you're gonna fill in a date saying when your buyer receives the documents. It doesn't say, when did I send them? It says, when did the buyer receive them?
The buyer's.
The condo writer.
Yeah.
As a seller's agent, would you not accept a contract if the HOA condo docs, this form was not signed by the buyer? Because if you accept a contract.
No, I wouldn't, because they can back out at any time.
Question
Would
in
it
the
be
back.
would it be acceptable then to put the date you email the buyer and their broker those documents as triggering the clock from that point forward, because you've got a time date stamp, hey, listen, I sent them the documents.
You're gonna email to the selling agent. If you're the listing agent, you're gonna email the documents to the selling agent along with a receipt of documents form. You're gonna ask them to deliver and send you back that form. Only if they don't do that are you then going to go back and look at your email as to when you sent them. You're always going to look for that document, receipt of documents, as the start of the clock. We have an online question.
Well, I was just, I don't believe that people online can hear the question from the
Okay,
class.
We'll repeat 'em.
we need to repeat them. Okay,
Thank you.
we will from going forward. Amy will repeat. One of us will. Are we ready? Let's go to HOA. So, I had a lot to do with this document. Been on the committee for the last 12 years. One of my gripes about the old version of the HOA rider is that it was one page and all it had was the obligatory statutory disclosure. This rider is now 2 pages, and it has contract contingency language in addition to the statutory disclosure. Now, one thing that you're going to see at the top of this rider that is different than all of the other riders, look with me where it says, when initialed by all the parties acknowledge that the disclosure set forth below was provided to the buyer prior to the execution of the Florida Realtors Florida Bar residential contract. That language appears only on this rider. Why? Because this rider in the HOA, a buyer does not have a 3-day right to receive the documents and to review them as they do in a condominium. But if you fail to provide this disclosure that's on page 1, then from the time that you provide that disclosure, the buyer has a 3-day right of rescission. So whenever the question came up, what if you don't have the condo rider? It's less consequential, other than the buyer has the right to terminate. It's less consequential than, well, I shouldn't say that because they have the right to terminate here too. This says that if they get it after they sign the contract, they get a 3-day right of rescission. Otherwise, they don't have a 3-day right of rescission under the HOA. Now, so that clause at the top is different because of that. All the other riders have just the incorporation of the language into the contract. So there are 2 parts to the HOA rider. Part A is the statutory obligatory language. It goes in and talks about how that the buyer has a voidable right should they not be provided this disclosure prior to signing the contract. And then the disclosure is the name of the community, and it basically goes on, hey, you're going to be obligated to be a member of this community. You're going to be obligated to pay fees and assessments. And what are they? Under 3, you're going to be obligated to pay. And here is where whether it's monthly, quarterly, annual, whatever the association assessment is for this HOA, that gets filled in there. And if there are currently any special assessments, that gets filled into the second part of number 3. Now, I see these forms that are given without any of that information filled in. Let me ask you this question. Is it the statutory disclosure if that information is not filled in? Shake your heads this way, okay? It's not. And so what I just got done telling you, if you don't get the disclosure, you get a 3-day right of rescission. So every attorney on the committee that I've talked to says if it's not filled in, it's not a disclosure. So make sure that that's filled in. It goes on, if there's a recreational lease or financial obligation, you need to fill what that is. And you'll notice that at the bottom of this page, there are signatures only for the buyers. Sometimes an agent doesn't understand conceptually what this is all about, and they want to get a seller to sign it. The seller doesn't have to sign this. This is a disclosure to the buyer about buying in an HOA, and it's only the buyer who signs it. Now, the seller will initial the top, but that's it. When you go to page 2 of this document, part B, this is a mandatory language that's added to the contract. This is incorporating the contract to modify the contract for an HOA. So you use this whenever it's a mandatory, or there's a requirement of paying assessments, or there are imposed restrictions. We have some older communities that have restrictions, but they don't have any assessments. You still need to use this for those communities because they impose restrictions, and that falls into the 3 categories at the top there under B. Now, under the approval, you need to check, is it or is it not required? Many HOAs do not require approval. It goes on and gives you a time frame. 10 days if left blank, then 5 days prior to closing. So you may want to do 5 days prior to closing is probably getting a little bit close. So I like 10 or 15 days, depending on how long you've got before you go to closing. Buyer's going to pay this application and related fees. or it's agreed to by the parties, whatever the split is. Buyer and seller shall sign and deliver any documents to get the approval granted. Now, notice the last sentence in paragraph 1. If approval is not granted within the stated time period above, buyer, underline that word, may terminate. That word may terminate is different than what's in the condo language. Because in the condo language, if the buyer is not approved within the time frame, it says it shall terminate. It's an automatic termination under the condo rider. It is an optional termination under the HOA rider. The buyer may terminate. Now, generally speaking, if approval is required, a buyer is not going to generally move forward. But it's a may, so you need to get the buyer to make a decision and to declare what that decision is, and you want to get it in writing to know what the intentions are, because you don't want to go all the way up until closing and then them say, I didn't get approved, I'm going to terminate. If you know they didn't get approved 10 days in advance, find out what they're going to do. Are they going to terminate? Now, paragraph 2. What we see on page 1 of this rider is where we put the special or the normal assessment that is assessed by the HOA. We added this section because there are many other fees associated with HOAs. For example, I'm going to give you some things you can fill in to illustrate why there's 4 lines there. The first one might be $300 one time for application and then the association's name. The next one could be $10,000 one time for an initial contribution to the association's name. The next one could be $500 per quarter food and beverage minimum to the country club at ABC. And lastly, it could be $5,000 one time for a special assessment for roads to the association. There are some different examples of things that would go in there. And that's why we have 4 lines there, because we wanted to give you lots of different options as to what to put there. Special assessments, basically those that are levied and are due before closing are going to be paid by the seller. If they can be paid after closing, then generally speaking, they will be paid by the buyer unless you check the box for the seller. Then they will be paid by the seller. And then lastly, it talks about fines that are imposed and charges to the association, say for an estoppel letter. By the way, there is some legislation right now that will do away with estoppel fees if it passes this year in the legislation. There is a bill to actually zero out estoppel fees. So stay tuned to see whether or not that happens. There's another bill that I want to tell you about that I have been fighting for. When we did this HOA rider, we had language in there that gave the buyer a 3-day right to receive documents, review them, and cancel, just like the condo. And as a committee, right before we published this form, we pulled it out because we thought we're leading the legislature. The legislature should make that change. I have been working with different legislatures, and we have a bill that I helped a legislator prepare and draft that is in front of the legislature this year. It's House Bill 627, if you want to follow it. And there is a companion Senate bill. And if that is passed, we will be changing the HOA rider to reflect a 3-day right of review and rescission, just like with the condo. Now, that's not there right now. I always teach and I always tell people, you can add that language to paragraph 20 if you want. And I'll give you a sample. You're not going to be able to take it down. But it says the contract's contingent upon the seller providing to buyer within 7 days of the effective date current copies of the following documents. And it lists all of them, including minutes and agendas for the last 12 months of the homeowners association. Buyer shall have 3 days from receipt of said documents to review them Anything not satisfactory to the buyer, the said documents, at buyer's option, shall have the right to terminate the contract with a return of the deposit monies. And if the contract doesn't close, buyer shall immediately return documents to the seller. The idea, I'm hopeful this will be in this rider shortly if the legislature passes this bill. Okay? Questions, yes?
Yeah, David, what is a reason or two that someone would be denied approval to a community? I've never had anyone denied.
Not usual, but
So it's not usual, and there's litigation as to why you can be, so, there's a Fair Housing Act.
Yeah.
Which basically says you really can't be, but what about an extensive criminal record? What about a sex offender, if the neighborhood is within 10 miles or so from a school?
Got
So
it.
there could be reasons, and one of the things that I wanted to say, if, although this says may, if you have a buyer who's not approved, check your declaration. Most homeowners association declarations will allow the association to go back in and void the sale if they don't approve a buyer. So while your buyer may be able to technically complete the sale, he's not going to get a clear title policy. There's going to be exception on there for approval. And he also runs the risk that the association files suit and tries to void the sale.
Okay.
How about age appropriate neighborhoods? Maybe somebody didn't know.
So age appropriate neighborhoods, there's actually a lot more leeway there than you would think. Some are 80% have to be over 55, but 20% don't. So then you get into, well, do you have the right to access everyone's age in the community? It's, so there's a fine line there. If your buyer's not approved, there's probably something going on. And then one other thing I wanted to mention with this homeowners association rider is similar to what David said with the condo rider. You can have a condo association and a homeowners association. You can also have multiple homeowners associations. So if you have multiple, I always think it's a better idea to use two riders as opposed to try and cram everything into one. That way you're very specific as to what is owed to each association.
And I will echo that because each of the riders has a place to put the name of the association. So you'd be better having two separate.
Okay.
Any other questions? We'll go on to seller financing. Amy?
All right. How many people have ever used a seller financing rider? Wonderful. Oh, one. I have, my notes here says always a bad idea. Always.
I didn't ask a lot. My fellow.
Always a bad idea. First page goes into some Dodd-Frank requirements and when your seller may or may not have to comply with these requirements. If it's a one-off transaction, your seller has never been a lender before, then yes, they're probably exempt for any Dodd-Frank type reporting requirements, interest rate requirements. If your seller is a constant lender, if he's a hard money lender, this is what they do. Still, do not use this. Do not use this. Likely they will have an attorney who drafts their documents for them and can draft an addendum for you. And the reason I say that you should not use this is that this is really only covers the bare bones of a mortgage transaction and loan. There is a lot that goes into it that is not addressed on here. And for one, who's drafting these documents? Who's paying for these documents? I mean, if I'm the buyer, I want my attorney to draft the documents. If I'm the seller, I'm the lender, I want my attorney to draft the documents. So, and how much are you gonna pay? I just had a contract come through where they wrote in, which was great, that the seller was going to have their attorney draft the documents, but then the buyer was gonna have to pay, and they didn't cap the amount, and the buyer got stuck with a huge bill at closing. So there's a lot of risks involved in not necessarily just using this rider, but in using seller financing in general. You have to let your seller know, not only are they becoming a lender, they might be coming at some point, a foreclosure plaintiff. It's not as easy as, okay, well, they didn't pay me a couple months, so I'm gonna go file an eviction against these people. No, they're not a tenant. They're the owner of the property. You're filing a mortgage foreclosure action against them. It's gonna take you 6, 8, 12 months to get these people out if they don't pay you. It's not a simple, couple week process like an eviction might be. So make sure your seller truly understands what this means. This also is lacking in the financial aspect of what it does to the seller. How do they report this on their taxes? How do they determine what interest rate to use? If they go too low, it's a gift. If they do go too high, they face penalties for usury. So there's a lot in here. It seems kind of beefy when you first look at it with all this Dodd-Frank material in the beginning, but it leaves a lot to the imagination. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say, if you look on page 1 of this rider, under number 2, you got through E. It says that a seller who finances the buyer's purchase of seller's residential property and who meets either of the 2 exclusions outlined above may use this seller financing rider. So if they don't meet the 2 exclusions, like Amy said, they need to have an attorney draft a rider for them. This is not the rider for them. This was designed to be something realtors could use that's not real complicated, but and for the seller who's doing the one-off in their lifetime, they would fall under the first exclusion and you would be okay using this. But if they're more sophisticated, somebody who's doing this more often, you're not using this rider for them. Any questions on the finance?
Good, don't use it.
Sometimes in this market that we're in right now with high interest rates, there are many sellers who are rich in equity. And we see a lot of deals where people are talking about seller financing. We're even seeing deals, I'm seeing right now, deals from investors who are trying to do wraparound financing with the first mortgage staying in place and the seller holding purchase money second mortgage on the with some of their equity. And so this rider may be used with that. But again, some of these very sophisticated transactions, get an attorney involved in them. Only be using this if it's pretty straightforward.
And just to touch on something David just said, it reminded me, a second mortgage, don't ever let your seller be a second mortgage holder. There is so much risk involved. They will likely never get paid, and there's probably not much they can do about it. So steer clear of that.
Yeah, we've seen the horror stories, and yet sellers sometimes want to do it because they want to make the deal. And you've got a lot of people out there who are wheeling and dealing. You've got a lot of seminars telling investor type people how to buy, how to use the seller's equity, how to get them to hold a second. And so we're seeing these creative deals happen. So let's move on to E, FHA and VA financing. Obviously, this is only used when you have government financing involved, either FHA or VA. There are not 2 separate riders for this. There is one, and they are incorporated together. You've got some definitions, and then you deal with the inspection and the appraisal. The FHA and VA have similar requirements as you read through them. A buyer can never be forced to purchase a property under either FHA or VA if the appraisal comes in for less than the sale price. But in both cases, FHA and VA, they have the option of moving forward and still purchasing it. Because the appraisal comes in low on an FHA and VA transaction, it doesn't automatically kill it, not even in a VA. The buyer has the right to move forward with the transaction. Now, in a VA where they were doing 100% financing and the appraisal comes in $10,000 low, the buyer's going to, out of their pocket, put the $10,000 up. But they can still move forward with the transaction and finance 100% of the appraised value and put the difference up in cash. Same way with FHA. The ratios get reworked. There will be cash out of pocket, but they have the right to do it. Many cases, FHA and VA buyers in our marketplace, FHA and VA buyers already feel discriminated against because sellers oftentimes don't want to see an FHA or VA. So when they get a seller who's willing to accept one and the appraisal comes in low, A lot of times they don't try to beat the seller up to reduce the value. They say, I'll put the money up because they want to continue with the transaction. So just be aware that that's there. Under the inspection, there is a repair limit under number 2 that exceeds the home inspection repair limit. So if you have an as-is contract and you're doing FHA or VA, you will have a repair limit for the government financing, and that comes from the appraiser, not from the home inspector. When the appraiser appraises the property, they may see some issues that need to be repaired, and they will flag them in the appraisal, and they are the things that fall under this repair limit. Now, if it exceeds the repair limit, the seller has the right to say, look, I'll pay it. You put a $500 limit in there, it's going to cost $1,000. Seller says, look, I'm going to do it. They have the right to do that. Okay. And there are some fees in both the FHA and VA under 3A. If left blank, it's 100, and under 4A, it defaults to 250. These are fees that are required by either FHA or VA for the seller to pay. Now, the ones under the VA, the one under 4A, that was modified in this last version because we used to spell out termite and administrative, and we list about 4 or 5 of them. We got rid of them because some of the lenders don't charge them anymore. And so we took them out and just left it as a generalized amount for fees that a lender may charge that the buyer can't pay, but the seller must pay. And then that last point, the election to proceed, again, they need to agree, buyer and seller need to agree. If we're going to adjust the purchase price, they need to do that within 3 days if they're going to proceed forward, so all parties know what's going on. Again, you may not use this that frequently. It's only for FHA and VA. Any questions on that? Our lenders in the back, yeah, they're saying we need that. It's got the statutory language that they need in order to do an FHA or VA deal. Sometimes you negotiate a conventional loan, and then when the lenders get a hold of it, they go, we can't get you approved conventionally. But if we switch into FHA, where FHA is much more lenient credit-wise, we could get you approved. Now you need to modify the contract and you need to add this rider, and the seller needs to agree to it. The buyer doesn't carte blanche got the authority to do this. Seller has to agree to it and initial off on this rider. Okay.
All right,
Thank you,
next
Fran.
we have the appraisal contingency rider. When we were first putting together this class, we decided we were going to talk about riders that are underutilized or misused. The next 2, I would say, are underutilized riders. In November, I think it was November of 2021, the contract was amended to include the following statement under the financing contingency. It says, during the loan approval period, it's contingent on the buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal or alternate valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender. If either is required by the lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for the lender to provide financing for the buyer and proceed to closing. A lot of people, I think, decided they didn't need to use the appraisal contingency rider when that language was built into the contract. And I would say maybe 8 out of 10 times it's not going to matter, right? You have a loan that's 80% of the value and the lender is going to require an appraisal that's at the appraised value. Well, what happens if your buyer is only financing 50% of the loan? The lender might not care that it appraises at the purchase price. And then what happens? Your buyer is stuck paying out of pocket, which maybe they were already going to pay out of pocket, but it just wouldn't sit well to me personally to know I'm paying $600,000 for a house that's worth $450, right? So always, consider this appraisal contingency, because you can set your limit. You can say the property needs to appraise exactly at your purchase price. You can put 5,000 under, 10,000, whatever your buyer is agreeable to. This puts your buyer in control of the valuation of the property. And I'll just quickly read part of this rider, which states that if the appraisal states the appraised value is less than the above value, buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller within 3 days after the above date. That's important. You only have 3 days to basically object to the evaluation and to cancel the contract. And deliver written notices to seller, either terminating the contract, in which event the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing buyer and seller from further obligations under the contract, or waiving and removing this contingency and continuing with the contract. So it still gives your buyer the option. It still allows them to say, you know what, I just love this property. I'm gonna pay the extra 5,000 and repair. But at least this puts control in your buyer's hands and not necessarily in the lender or in the seller, or give control to your purchase price. The next rider.
Wait. Before you go on,
Yeah.
I want to talk a couple things on this appraisal contingency. Couple things that I think are really important. First of all, on the second line, there's a date. Now, the default on that is if left blank 10 days prior to closing. Here's the issue. The finance clause in the new version of the contract that recently came out requires during the loan approval period that you get the financing and the appraisal done. And if you don't get the appraisal done during the loan approval period, you cannot have loan approval. I don't care what the lenders call it. They can tell you that you got loan approval. If you don't have the appraisal per the terms of the contract, you do not have loan approval. But this rider says you could get the appraisal up till 10 days prior to closing, which could be outside of the loan approval period. Now we've got a conflict. And really, maybe we don't. If you don't have the appraisal within the loan approval period, you don't have loan approval, which means you just became a cash buyer. Okay? And that's not where you want to be. So if you are using this rider, big asterisk, make sure the date that you put in here coincides with whatever the 30-day time period is for the loan approval period. Okay? Make sure they're together. Because if they're not, and you leave it up until 10 days before closing, you're a cash buyer. Now, if the appraisal comes back low, you could terminate. This rider still gives you the right to do that, but it puts you in conflict because, well, you're a cash buyer. So don't get there. My point, make sure the two go together. Next, written appraisal on the first line. The buyer has the right to get a written appraisal. That is your traditional appraisal. The contract now, when it talks about you getting an appraisal to meet the loan approval, the contract stipulates an appraisal or alternative valuation, where that is not a traditional appraisal. Could be desktop underwriting. But this rider requires a traditional appraisal. So if you're going to use this, you're going to pay an appraiser to do a traditional appraisal, not an alternative desktop or CRM. It's going to be a regular appraisal. And then there's only two options: terminate or waive. What if you want to renegotiate the contract? This, excuse me, this rider does not give that as an option. Now, the parties always have the right to do something contrary, but you would need to amend the contract if you're going to negotiate and modify the purchase price. When should you use this rider? Amy gave you an example. Let me list for you my 3 top reasons to use this rider. Number 1, when you have a cash buyer who's concerned about it appraising, even though they're not getting financing and appraisal is not required, and they don't want to pay more than what it appraises for. Number 2, when they're financing, but they're putting more than 20% down. Because if you're putting 50% down, the finance clause says the appraisal needs to be sufficient. It doesn't need to be for the purchase price. If you want it to be for the purchase price, then you need to use this rider. Because sufficient, when you get a 50% LTV, you get a way low appraisal and it still be sufficient. The third is when it's a cash buyer, but the cash buyer is getting a loan. They check the box cash to be competitive, but they know they're going to get a loan. And they know they're going to need to do an appraisal. And so you may want to use this rider. I will tell you, when you use this rider, you take away the magic from your contract. If you're a cash buyer, what makes that magical is there's no loan approval and there's no appraisal. If you are 50% down buyer, the magic of that is any listing agent's going to tell the seller, if you have 3 offers and they are identical in every way except for the loan to value ratio, one's 50, one's 80, and one's 95. If they're identical in all other terms, which one's the seller going to take? They're going to take the 50, because the listing agent's going to say it won't have to appraise for the full price. And if it comes in low, we're still going to be able to do this deal. But once you put this rider in, you take that magic away. So just be aware of that. And the decision to put this rider in my opinion, is not necessarily yours. It's the buyer. The buyer needs to understand the pros and the cons of it. And it's up to you to explain the pros and the cons to it, and then let them make the decision.
Explain again why it's needed if you have a cash buyer who's getting a small loan.
Well,
If you have a financing contingency, then the appraisal requirement that's built into the financing contingency says that the appraised value must be satisfactory to the lender. The lender's not going to care about the total purchase price as much if they're only financing a very small amount of that purchase price. They just want to make sure that their interest is protected. So if the property appraises at 20% more of their loan, they pass it through underwriting and they're usually fine with that.
I'm sorry, I still don't understand. I just had a situation where I had a cash buyer, but we said the deal was not contingent on a loan. But he
went and got financing in.
financing and we needed an appraisal, which I was surprised that we did need an appraisal.
So first of all,
I used this.
you don't need this for him to be able to do an appraisal. Paragraph 18L says that the seller will provide access to the property for inspections and the appraisal. 18L does not say only if there's a finance contingency. So a cash buyer has the right to do an appraisal. They just don't have the right to cancel if the appraisal comes in low. If they want the right to cancel, you need to use this rider. That's the only thing you get from here is the right to cancel.
Here's an online question.
Online question.
So if it appraises for less and both parties would like to renegotiate, do you terminate the contract and rewrite a new contract with a new price, or can you just do an addendum for the agreed new price?
An addendum for the agreed new price.
Just amend the purchase contract to the new price.
Yep. All right.
Okay, Amy.
Next rider is similar to kind of the rationale behind using it. So the next rider is the homeowners and flood insurance rider. This is one of my favorite riders to see, because then I know that the agents and the parties have already thought about insurance. Everyone in here who's a homeowner knows insurance has skyrocketed. I don't care who you are, I don't care where you live, insurance has gone up. And if you're moving from out of state, you might have no idea how much Florida homeowners insurance has gotten. I mean, you think about people from up north coming down here and they think, oh, it's less taxes, less insurance, but we are creeping up there. And there is, especially if it's a cash contract, there's no out if your buyer cannot get insurance. If they are charged an exorbitant amount to insure that property, they do not have a right to terminate the contract. They are stuck. They can either pay the exorbitant amount or they can self-insure and basically not have insurance if it's cash. So that is a serious and significant risk, especially in Florida. I don't really care where you live, but especially in Florida. And even if you have a financing contingency, the insurance rates might just not be what you want them to be. Now, a lot of times, if a lender sees that insurance rates are too high and it makes it where it's not affordable for you, you might have an out under your financing contingency. You might not. Your lender might say, no, well, you might not have, you might have zero at the end of your account every week, but we can still do it. So you're going to have to get this insurance. So take some time and research the insurance rates on the property before, you put in an offer. See if it's something that is it should always make a difference to buyers, but obviously some are more, financially equipped than others. So find out what a reasonable insurance rate would be for the property. And then use this rider to give your buyer the option to cancel. One other thing I will say is don't rely on what the seller is currently paying.
So true.
They might tell your buyer, oh, I only pay $2,500 a year. Well, his policy's been in place 20 years. He knows his broker. He's been working at the company for 6 years. You don't know. You don't know how he got that rate. And, it's probably not transferable in any way, shape, or form. So always do your research prior to and use this rider to help your buyer. It's just one more thing that they can hang their hat on if a property becomes not affordable. I will tell you guys my background. I don't know what was on the bios for us, but my background is in foreclosure litigation. So I can tell you, we would get referrals all the time to foreclose on properties because payments went up because of insurance, because people could not afford it. It is something that makes a home not affordable to people all the time. So just make sure you're properly advising your buyer as to what they're looking at when they're getting the insurance.
So if the buyer's truly just says, hey, Ange, I really want this, and it's a water in the back, because I have a property, water in the back and the front end went up a lot, but anyway, if they really want it, at what point do we start shopping, saying?
Right away, as soon as they say I want it. Go talk.
Submit?
Yeah,
Before you submit the offer.
of course, why not? Go ask an insurance agent how much it would be.
Before she says, let's put in an offer.
Sure.
And then get.
It costs nothing to get a quote.
Right away.
Costs nothing. And then at least you know.
Right.
Also, the transferability takes a long time and it pulls up closing. People wait to do that.
Yeah.
For the seller to be willing and all that.
On
It
flood.
works, yeah, on flood.
Can't transfer homeowners,
Right.
only transfer flood.
And it's a big savings. It's like double.
Oh, yeah.
They're gonna- Yeah.
So just an FYI, on flood insurance, if the seller has the National Flood Insurance Program and they've had it for a number of years, you always want to assume that policy. Because if you rewrite the policy under today's rules, they're called 2.0, they're almost double. And so you always want to assume a national flood insurance policy. Now, a couple things that I'd like to just add here. Make it very clear. There is no provision in the contract that allows you to cancel it based on the cost of insurance. The only, as Amy said, it comes down to the mortgage. If your ratios are out of whack, you won't get approved, but that should be within 30 days. A lot of times within the 30 days loan approval period, you don't know what your cost of insurance is. Historically, typically, agents wait till right before closing to get homeowners and flood insurance quotes.
Still, not historically, still, they still do it.
And that drives us nuts, okay? Amy just answered that question. Do it even before you start your contract. Get to know what the insurance costs are. And then use this rider. I'm going to tell you carte blanche. If the house is older than 20 years, you need to be using this rider on every transaction. Why? Because older properties, if it's original roof, you may have a hard time finding insurance. If it's original appliances, the 4-point may not pass. You may not get a good 4-point, and your rates, you'll get insurance, but your rate's going to be above whatever you fill in here. Get a preliminary quote. They can't final quote you until they get the 4-point, until they get the wind mitigation. So they're not gonna have all that when they give you the quote. That's the whole reason to use this. If you get a quote for 3,000 and you put 32 or 3,300 in here, and then you get a bad wind mitt and it comes back at $6,000, you've got a right to cancel, but only because you attach this rider. On flood insurance, the second part of this rider, look at the first line, because most of you don't even know you have this right. The first line says, in addition to the right of termination provided to the buyer in paragraph 10D. If you look in the contract under 10D, that deals with FEMA and flood insurance. And if you're in an A or E zone, A or V zone, and the base flood is below, the first floor is below base flood, you've got a right to terminate within 20 days. But once you pass the 20 days, which is the default in the contract, you no longer get the right to terminate. But if you have this rider, the only reason you're terminating now is because the cost of flood insurance is higher than what amount you put in there. So get your quotes on that too and put it in both of them and use this. This is an important rider.
And again, you know, the default on these dates are 30 days after effective date or 10 days prior to closing. Try and do it earlier. You know, do it as quickly as you can and, you know, as far in advance of closing as you can.
Do it earlier. Yes.
Question, like some people getting their roofs repaired for the 25-year. Isn't there like a stigma on there that you did a claim? So you have a new roof, right? You represented by, and the buyer's agent said, hey, new roof, we're gonna look pretty good on insurance. But there's something you can back check claims, right? So if there was a claim on that home or I'm sorry to back you in an insurance question, but can that hurt the buyer coming in that there was a claim on that house? Now forget the website you could use to see what claims were.
Is there a potential?
Yeah,
There is.
Even though it's new.
But it probably will balance out with the discount you're getting for having a new roof.
Repeat the question for the.
Oh,
Oh.
sorry. So the question was, when you file a claim to your insurance, there's a history of that. And so if a seller fixes a roof or a buyer fixes a roof right away, does it negatively impact them in getting new insurance? Because it was a claim for a new roof. And the answer was, it could, you know, you're gonna have a claim on the record of that house. However, you now have a new roof. So it probably would balance out, if not weigh in favor of get the new roof.
You're gonna have a lot more options with insurance when you got a newer roof.
David, you said that, of course, all of this has to do with the cash buyer, and I'm not sure I understood. If you have a finance transaction, you mentioned that there is. you
Yeah,
don't
so-
Need to use this? Or
Yeah, so you should still use this.
Absolutely.
You should still use
It's not
this.
just cash.
What I was referring to is that if you cannot get insurance during your loan approval period, that is typically a condition of the loan approval that you get insurance, right? So if you have a loan approval period and you're not past that time frame, you can still back out, you can still terminate. So you do still have a small window of termination if it's a financing contingency
But you would
contract.
still use this.
Oh,
even-
Yes.
Yes, you should.
House is older than 20 years, I'm telling you, carte blanche, you should be
Or
using this
any
right.
condo, you know, condo insurance these days is very hard. It's very hard to get, you know, waterfront is very hard to get. It's just, I mean, and not only hard to get, but just so expensive, so expensive.
I'm happy to say it's getting better. The legislation that's been passed the last 2 years, we are already seeing insurance companies come back into the state that have left. We're seeing new companies being formed and coming in. We are seeing tangible results in this area of insurance. It's going to take another year or two before you see it in your premiums.
I'm hearing that the X flood zone is gonna become a flood zone. Is that true? Have you heard that? That all X is gonna become a flood zone?
What's happening is Citizens is the first one to lead the way. Citizens is phasing in. Every Citizens policy will be required to have flood insurance in addition to homeowners insurance. And I expect other insurance carriers to follow suit on that. And pretty soon we may see that X zones will be required to have flood insurance as well. The reason for that is when you get a hurricane, there's always the dispute between the flood insurance and the wind insurance. what caused the damage? Was it the wind or was it the flood? Did the flood come up or did the flood come down? And so you get out of those arguments if you have both coverages. So that's some of the logic, and I believe you're gonna see more of that coming in the year ahead. All right, we need to keep moving because we already be short on time. But a lot of good questions, that's why we're here, right? So mold inspection. I hate mold too. I was involved in this drafting of this rider because we never had a mold rider for the FAR bar contract. If you wanted to add a mold rider, you had to use the crisp version of it. And so I pushed the committee and was involved in putting this together. And we now have a mold inspection rider, which basically gives the buyer the right to terminate. Now, you only use this in a standard contract. There is no place for it in an as-is contract. In paragraph 19, it just says reserved an I. And the reason for that is under an as-is, you already got the right to cancel. This gives you the right to cancel under a standard contract if mold is discovered. Now, when we drafted this, we went back and forth. As in the standard contract under general, if you have repairs that exceed the repair limit, the seller can always do the repairs in excess of the repair limit and keep the buyer in it. When we drafted this, we had one version of it that had a similar logic, that you gave a limit, and if it exceeded that limit, the seller would have the right to pay the excess and keep the buyer in it. We ultimately decided against that. So what this rider does is gives you a limit. In this case, it defaults to $500. And if it exceeds that limit, the buyer has the right to cancel the contract or continue it. Why? Because mold is a very sensitive issue to certain people. And if it has mold in it and it affects their health, they don't care if the seller fixes it. They don't want to buy it. And so we opted to go with that provision. Now you can bump the limit because every house, your showers, they get mold in them. We live in Florida. You kill it with Clorox. That's different than the sticky box, mold, the black mold, the stuff that's really, bad for your health. That's a different thing, but it takes longer. So if you look in the first paragraph, under this paragraph, you get 20 days. The standard home inspection is 15. We added 5 days. Why? Because you got to send out lab tests and you got to wait for them to come back, and it takes longer. So we gave you by default 20 days to get that done. And during that inspection, any evidence of the existence or any related damage that is there from previous mold that somebody may have cleaned up. Now, you may have to be invasive. You may have to cut some drywall out to see what's behind it. And in that case, you need to repair it and provide seller receipts for it. But if you do the inspection and deliver the report or the cancellation, you have the right to get out, cancel, and get your money back. If you fail to either do it or deliver the notice, then you're stuck with it. So as an agent, you need to watch them.
Can you incorporate something like mold into a rental agreement, something like that?
I'm trying to think. You can. I'm trying to think if the Florida Realtors form has a mold. I think that it does.
The Florida Bar has a pretty extensive
Yeah.
mold addendum in their form lease. So there's definitely some documents out there to use those guidelines.
I have a question, Amy.
Yes.
So with an as-is contract, typically, some sellers want to see a shorter time period, but the mold may take longer. So would that be appropriate to use this, or would we get an attorney to write language into the as-is that 7 days, except for we need
Absolutely, yeah. You can have a mold exception, you know, basically carving out extra time for mold. You- Everything else we'll do in 7 days.
So would this be appropriate as is, or would we need the language from an attorney?
I would always say use the language from an attorney, but. But I think that's a pretty comprehensive writer as
Well, that's
well.
what I was wondering if you
Does
did.
it supersede
You-
contract?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking here, there is no, you can't check a box in paragraph 19 for I, but you could go to paragraph 20 and you could put, right or I
Yeah.
mold, inspection is hereby incorporated and included in this
Right,
contract.
and all timeframes in I supersede, or however you want to craft it, but I think it would be nice to have that language and also have some language in section 20 or 23 specifying exactly what you want.
This language gives you definitions of a mold inspection and a mold inspection
Right.
period. So they will stand alone apart from the as-is inspection period if you add it.
But you said here that obviously the seller cannot pay the excess. It is entirely up to the buyer if there is an issue.
Seller could if the buyer agreed to it, but the way this addendum is written is that the ball is totally in the buyer's court. And if the seller says, look, I'll pay to repair this and remediate it, and the buyer goes, okay,
It's okay.
then you do an amendment and you do that. It's the same way with WDO. If you exceed the repair limit in WDO, there's no provision that automatically allows the seller to do it and the buyer's stuck. The ball's in the buyer's court, but you can agree and do an amendment to the parties
That's
agree to do
buyer's
that.
choice in both
But it's
cases.
buyer's choice, both mold and WDO, for the same logic and the same reason.
And always do an amendment. Don't just assume, well, we had this and it gave us 20 days and the seller said he'd pay, so okay, we're covered
Yeah,
under that.
absolutely not.
You know,
Always do
always,
an amendment.
always document it and amend it.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Any others? Amy,
All right.
hey,
So, I'm gonna be brief on this one because when David and I first met, I will tell you, I have never seen this writer, ever. You see an as-is contract, you see a standard contract. Why do I need an as-is writer that basically removes everything from the standard and makes it an as-is? So, you know, I went through and the first 1A gave me, you know, cause for concern, right? It says paragraph 9A1, paragraph 9A2, paragraph 9A3. That's fine. Those are repair limit. I understand why they would take that out. And then you've got paragraph 11 and paragraph 12 are all deleted. There's a lot of information in paragraph 11 and paragraph 12. There's a lot of requirements in there. And not all of them are then incorporated into this writer. So, what this says basically, it's an attempt to turn a standard contract into an as-is. But the attorney in me, I don't know if I love it or I hate it, because I feel like there's so many different contradictions that I could probably argue it, but I don't really want to because I don't think any of the arguments are good. But because we're short on time, I'll just bring up a couple of things that I spotted that I think are cause for concern when you use this as-is contract. So one of the things that this would change is your walkthrough. So if you go all the way down to 3, and I am skipping around just to kind of hit the important parts, is this still allows you to do a walkthrough. It allows a walkthrough prior to closing to confirm that all items of personal property are on the real property and that the property has been maintained as required by paragraph 3. At the buyer's option and cost, seller shall at closing assign all assignable repair, treatment, maintenance, contracts, and warranties to the buyer. That's very similar to the walkthrough language in the standard contract. But what it left out is that part of the walkthrough in a standard contract allows the buyer to make sure the seller has met all other contractual obligations. So if you use this writer, you take that piece out. That piece was part of one of the paragraphs that got deleted. So you're not allowing your buyer to do a walkthrough and basically check on everything. Your walkthrough is more limited by using this writer.
Where was that at in the general contract, Peter?
I think it was in, Was it 11 or 12?
It's 11 and so.
Yeah, so all of 11 and all of 12 are deleted. So unless it's built back into this rider somehow, you have removed that. Right, right. This is another that, you know, you might want to just steer clear and use the as-is contract.
And so I'm gonna agree with Amy. We said we don't always have to agree with each other. But this is used as a simple way to convert a standard contract to an as-is. Your buyer presents a standard contract to the seller. Seller says, I want an as-is. They don't want to rewrite it. So you add this to it and it converts the standard to an as-is. Is it a perfect conversion? No. As Amy just pointed out, there are some deficiencies because you just can't modify every single paragraph. So there are some deficiencies. So my preference also would tell you to be rewrite it on an as-is, and now you got an as-is 100%. But it's there if you want to do the shortcut. Any other questions on this? All right, let's go to L. This is a fun one. This is a good one. This is what I call the hybrid. This gives you the best of both worlds. This lets you have your cake and eat it too. Okay, you like your cake and you like to eat it too. This rider does that because it gives you the ability to have an as-is right to cancel or to ask the seller to do repairs up to the repair limit. Interesting. And I'll give you some examples in a minute when you might want to use it. Let me just say that this can only be used with a standard contract. You do not use this with an as-is contract. Does not work with an as-is contract. Only a standard contract. This is going to modify the standard contract, as paragraph 12, but it does not replace paragraph 12. Unlike the rider that we just looked at, the K as is, where it deletes certain paragraphs, this doesn't delete any paragraphs, it simply modifies them. So in the first section, it says in lieu of the inspection period that's in the standard contract, you now have what's called a right to inspect period. Just different terminology, and you default to 15 days, and you can do all inspections that you want. Okay, so the difference between as-is and standard, you get to do certain inspections, and it has to be by a licensed individual. As is, anybody can do the inspections and you can inspect for anything you want. So this gives you during this right to inspect period, similar to what the as is, anybody can inspect and for anything. Now, later on, we're going to see that you can ask for repairs. But those, if you're going to ask for repairs, they can only be based on the warranted items that are in paragraph 12, not just anything. And mold is not a warranted item in paragraph 12 of a standard contract. So it doesn't give you mold or even some other things. You got to follow the list when you go to ask. So right to inspect, similar to as is, any inspections by anybody. But if you're going to ask for repairs, then there's going to have to be inspections that were done by professionals. So the buyer goes, well, you know, I've renovated a bunch of houses, I'm going to do my own inspection. And then they come back and want to ask for repairs. Nope. It's got to be by somebody who is a professional based on the language of paragraph 12 if you're going to revert and ask for repairs under paragraph 12. Paragraph 2 just talks about doing repairs to the property. Paragraph 3, if buyer determines in their sole discretion it's not acceptable, they can terminate. That's the same language that's in the as is. It gives you the right to carte blanche terminate. You don't have to provide an inspection report. You don't have to provide anything. You get the right to cancel. 4, this is where it's the hybrid. That now, if the buyer elects to proceed with the contract, or if they fail to provide, then you know they lose out. But if they're going to proceed, then they can deliver reports to the seller of the defective items, and the seller will pay up to the applicable amounts required under the paragraph 9, the repair limits for general WDO and permits. So now we go back to those repair limits. Now we go back to the warranted items and we get the seller to make those repairs. If the buyer doesn't conduct this inspection or fails to timely deliver notice, then it goes away. The seller has no obligation to do anything. So let me give you a couple ideas of when this might be beneficial. You're buying a house that's got a barrel tile roof, and the barrel tile roof is 25 years old. As far as you know, it doesn't leak, but you want your home inspector to do it. So you add this rider. If your home inspector goes, this roof is in great condition, really no problem. You got probably 10 years of life. There's no leaks. Then you want to continue with the contract. But during the home inspection, they found a whole bunch of other things, and you want the seller to fix those things. So you decide, I'm not going to cancel, but I am going to ask now the seller to do these repairs for the warranted items. If you use a standard contract, if that roof is not leaking, but your home inspector goes, whoa, this baby's bad. You got maybe 1 or 2 years. If it's not leaking under standard contract, you don't have a right to cancel. You're stuck with it. It doesn't matter if it's got 1 year of useful life. If there's no leaks, it's not a defect under the standard contract. But here, you have an as-is right to cancel. If the inspector tells you that roof is about shot, then man, I'm out of here because it's a $60,000 roof and I don't want to get involved in repairing that roof. But if it's still good for another 10 years, then I want to buy the house and I want the seller to do repairs. Second example I'll give you is a weekend warrior converted the garage to a 3rd bedroom. And you're going like, okay, no permits were pulled. I have no idea if this was done really good. I want to get a home inspector. Now, again, you could use an as-is contract, but if you use an as-is contract and then you want to have repairs made, the seller can say no. But if I use this, my inspector says, look, even though they didn't pull a permit, I can tell you that everything I can see, everything looks like it's been done professionally and to code and is in really good shape. I wouldn't worry about it. Well, now I want to proceed forward. I want to buy this place, but I want the seller to do the other repairs that may be found through the home inspection under the warranted items. So now I don't cancel and ask the seller to do repairs. But what if the home inspector goes, whoa, man, run from this place. This was so poorly done. This is half-assed every way I can see it. Well, under standard contract, you wouldn't be able to cancel. But under this rider L, I now have the right to terminate and be out of there, or stay in and have seller do repairs for defective warranted items. I don't recommend you use this on every contract. I recommend you use it when it's necessary. Otherwise, choose a standard or as is.
Is the seller who demands a standard contract?
Unlikely to accept rider L because it still gives the right of cancellation, just like an as is.
All right, everyone's favorite rider, lead-based paint. All right, so first thing, lead-based paint, pre-1978 housing. How do you know how old the house is? Well, you ask your seller, right? Well, what if they say, I don't know, I bought it last year, I'm just trying to flip it, make a couple $100,000, right? Property appraiser's website will tell you the year it's built. It's always on there. Do not look at effective year built, which is usually the one right beside that bumps up into the 2000s. Look at the year built. If it's before 1978, you need this rider. This rider is pretty self-explanatory. Does your seller have any knowledge whatsoever that lead-based paint was used in the property? If they do, they have to disclose it. One item under the buyer acknowledgement that I want to point out is number D. Buyer has received the pamphlet, protect your family from lead in your home. Whose responsibility is it to give buyer the pamphlet?
Listing agent.
Listing agent. not the seller. The seller does not have to go find the pamphlet and give it to the buyer. The listing agent should give it to the buyer. I don't see this often, and I don't know if it's just because it doesn't get attached to the contract, and so people don't tend to send it to the closing agents. But I also have a sneaking suspicion that they're not giving it out. So just FYI, all parties are signing this. Your buyer is signing that they received a copy of the pamphlet. The agent is signing that they've given the seller all the information that they need to give him regarding lead-based paint. So just keep this rider in mind, make sure you're complying with it. These pamphlets, they have digital versions. You can find them very easily online. Just Google 1978 lead-based paint disclosure packet, or Google the exact title of the package, and you can pull it right online and just make sure everybody has seen a copy of it.
Let me just ask a question. Does anyone here look really good in orange? Because this is federal.
Mhm.
That means they have the right to give you jail time or up to $10,000 fine if you consistently don't use this. I don't think they're going to give it to you for one time missing it, but if you consistently blow this off as, who cares?
And guys, God forbid somebody have damages, it's triple damages if you knew about it and then didn't disclose it to your buyer.
Is it wrong that I'm always giving that pamphlet to my buyers and not, does it matter who
Nope.
gets it? Okay.
Nope.
As long as they get
As
it.
long as somebody gets it.
Okay.
You're next.
Three of those close
Leaf
out.
purchase.
Okay, so the next three I'm gonna lump together, even though they're very different. So the first one is lease purchase option. Second one is pre-closing occupancy by buyer. And the next one is post-closing occupancy by seller. Now, 6 months ago, seller post-closing occupancies were running rampant, right? Everybody wanted to sell, but they didn't have anywhere to go. So we were seeing these all the time. And while this is required if you're going to have post-closing occupancy from the seller in some way, shape, or form, this doesn't give us a lot of information. What this does is this says this is essentially an agreement to agree, which in the legal world is nothing, right? So this says that the parties, certain time frame, are going to agree on all the material terms of the occupancy, whether it's pre, post, whether it's a lease to purchase, but that's about it, right? It asks you who's gonna pay, and it tells you if you can't come up with an agreement that, you know, the contract should be terminated, but it doesn't really do more than that. It doesn't tell you, you know, what kind of language you're going to put in your lease. It's not going to tell you who's going to pay for everything, you know, during these terms of pre-closing or post-closing occupancy. All of that gets worked out once we start drafting the agreements. And it's amazing how everybody is fine to sign this. But then as soon as you start asking the questions of, oh, well, did you talk about this? Did you talk about this? No. And both parties have completely different ideas as to what's actually going to happen. So my suggestion is if you're using any of these agreements, number one, build out as much time as possible without messing up your closing to come up with an agreement. So you don't want to give up until the day before closing, because then if everybody can't come to terms, then your deal falls apart. But you also don't want to give 5 days. These are important documents. They need to be drafted by an attorney. Don't pull lease online that's 2 pages long. Get an attorney to talk to your clients, find out exactly what their intent is, and then to draft the appropriate document. I like to suggest that the parties split costs on stuff like this, because then everybody has a skin in the game. I found that if my client is paying, I often get a lot more opposition from the other side because they think that, you know, I'm on one side. Well, I'm still on that side, but if they're paying off the bill for whatever reason, I just feel like they cooperate a little more. And these agreements typically, you know, they don't take a ton of time, so it's not, you know, a ton of time on one side or the other. But try and have them split it, try and have them work together, figure out as many details as possible before you send it over to the attorney to start drafting. But keep in mind, this one page is not all you need. This doesn't do it, right? This is not a lease. This is not a occupancy agreement by any stretch of the imagination. You always need that separate document.
Let me just also say that in the first two, the leaseback and the pre, they are within 5 or 10 days of the effective date, so they get done pretty quickly. The challenge that I find with the post occupancy is that goes all the way up till 10 days prior to closing. So now you're within 10 days of closing and you can't get agreement on the terms of a post occupancy, the deal could die.
Happens
So,
all the time.
and it
Yeah.
does. So there's a blank there. Write in, depending on when your closing date is, you'll have to figure out what the appropriate amount of time is, but don't wait till 10 days. The other thing that the U post does not address is security deposit and whether or not there's going to be a security deposit. So there's some changes that I'm going to be recommending that we make to this.
And again, similar to that seller financing rider, this doesn't give any guidance to anybody about tax implications.
Right.
So there is rental tax implications for everybody, and your seller and your buyer, everybody should be advised of those. Because you will see attorneys slip it right into that agreement. One party has to pay taxes and nobody knows. So just make sure you talk about all that stuff with your buyers and your sellers.
So let's move on. We're pretty much out of time, but we've got a couple more. So if you'll hang tight, we can get through these fairly quickly. V is an important one because V is a home sale contingency. And in the finance provision, there's a carve out that if you fail to add rider V and you come up with a loan approval that is contingent upon the sale of other real estate, it is considered not to be a loan approval by the definition and terms of the contract. So when you have a buyer that does in fact need to sell a home in order to get the equity out to purchase the new home, or can't carry two mortgages, they can't carry the mortgage on the old house plus the mortgage on the new house, they can't get approval, and that it's going to be contingent upon the sale of their home, then you better use rider V. Otherwise, at the end of 30 days, you will not have a loan approval when that loan approval comes back saying it is subject to the sale of the property at 123 Main Street prior to closing. It isn't going to happen. You'll be a cash, or you'll terminate the contract is what you'll most likely do. Or if you don't terminate it, you'll become a cash buyer. So adding rider V is an important aspect of the contract. It makes the contract not only contingent upon the sale of that other real estate, but on the closing of that other real estate. You see that on the first line, contingent on sale and closing of the property located at. So it doesn't satisfy itself when their property goes under contract. It's got to close. So upon entering into a contract, you're going to give the seller a copy of the contract. It's going to be redacted. And then if the sale of the buyer's property does not close by and there's a date. Now, here's the common mistake I see all the time. People put the date in here to match the date of the closing. The two cannot be simultaneous because you've got 3 days to decide. If the buyer's property doesn't close, you've got 3 days to decide what you're going to do. Well, if it's the day of the closing, you don't have 3 days, your contract is terminated. So you need to have 7 to 10 day gap between the date you put here. Now, this is also a pragmatic thing for the seller. Does the seller want to vacate their house and then have a home sale contingency date that goes right up until the day of closing? Now they've vacated their house, and on the day of closing, buyer's house didn't close for whatever reason. They had been under contract, but it didn't close. Now you're done. The seller's like, well, what just happened to me? My house is vacant. All my furniture is gone. And you're telling me that you're canceling based on the home sale contingency? Well, that's not fair and balanced to the seller. I don't care what side of the transaction you're on. So there always needs to be a gap. I'll tell you 7 to 10 days. Now, if the seller's property is already vacant and they're not moving out, then maybe you can skinny that down a couple days, because here's the other problem. buyer sells their house, packs up all their stuff, it's sitting in a moving van, you got a 10-day gap, it's gonna sit in storage for 10 days. So each circumstance and situation is a little bit different, but you gotta balance out those dates. And then you gotta indicate is the buyer's property either under contract or not. Now, how long of a date or what date you put in there is also going to depend on a couple things. If it's not if it is under contract, then you're most likely going to put that date as the date of the closing date on their contract for their sale. And then the closing date for this transaction a week to 10 days later. If it's not under contract, you're just going to market with it, then you're projecting a date. You're picking 30, 60, 90 days that you think you can sell the buyer's property and get it to closing and putting that date. So the last paragraph just indicates, is it under contract or not? If it is under contract, you need to provide a copy of that. And there's a 24-hour provision also. Moving on, W, backup contract. You would use this form anytime that the property is already under contract. Maybe it's got a home sale contingency, but maybe it's just got an inspection contingency. Maybe it's got a finance contingency. One of the things that is a strategy for you, if you're not doing this, if you're working with a buyer and you can't find an active property, start looking at the pendings and start looking at the pendings and see if there's a property that meets their needs, because you can always put a backup contract in on a pending. Call the listing agent, find out what the contingencies are. And if there's a chance, especially if there's a home sale contingency or whatever, then you could put a backup contract in. Now, the backup contract is subject to the termination of that contract that's in first position. And when that contract terminates, the seller gives notice to the buyer. And at that time, the buyer's contract moves into a first position. Now, note that the effective date on this backup contract, in the contract, you have two concepts. You have an acceptance and you have an effective date. With a backup contract, you get acceptance, but you don't get an effective date. Normally, they're the same. But in a backup contract, the effective date is to be determined. The effective date comes when the seller gives notice that the primary contract is terminated and the backup contract moves into that first position. That is the effective date, and that's when you're generally going to make your deposits. But if for some reason the buyer made a deposit that accompanied the offer, then if they terminate the backup, then they would get a refund of that deposit. The buyer has the unilateral right to terminate their backup at any time. Kickout clause. If you're using the home sale contingency, a seller may want to consider using the kickout clause. The kickout clause gives the seller the right to continue to market the property and enter into a backup, the one we just looked at. And if they do enter into a backup, to give the buyer notice that they have a backup contract, provide them a copy of it with information obliterated, and the buyer then has a decision to make. I love the fact that in order for the buyer to move forward, they can't just say, oh, we're going to move forward. We'll remove the financing and the home sale contingency. No, they got to put their money where their mouth is, because that blank is, in order for the buyer to continue, they must make an additional deposit. This is a deposit in addition to what's on page 1 of the contract. And I would tell you that deposit needs to be at least $10,000. Because if it's not big enough, if it's $1,000, the $1,000, the buyer will take a risk. I'll put up $1,000, but $10,000, no, I don't want to lose $10,000. Because if they put up $10,000 and remove the home sale contingency and the finance contingency and then can't close, they're going to lose the 10 plus the initial deposits. So this is a great rider. Real quick, Amy.
All right, buyer and seller approval, attorney approval writers. Everybody loves a short acceptance date, right? 24 hours, 48 hours, What does that mean for people like me? It means I get a frantic email. Can you look at this really quick? I want to sign, but I don't have time at the end of the day. Try to utilize these attorney approval writers. This will allow everybody to sign the contract and take a breath. You build in, 3 to 5 days for an attorney review. And that allows the attorney more time, gets everybody under contract. Like I said, take a breath, take a relax, think about it. And then the attorney can actually do what the attorney needs to do, review the contract and let their client, whether it's buyer or seller, know any concerns that the attorney may have. Now, this doesn't give you the right to go back and negotiate, right? It doesn't say anything about negotiation, but it does give you the right to terminate during that time period. So you can ask for anything you want and you can start a negotiation. It doesn't necessarily mean the other side has to cave on any item in the contract, but at least it gives you a small window of opportunity to discuss the matter with your attorney, see if there's anything glaring that you might want to walk away from. And then, after your attorney review period, you guys can move forward as normal. The other very one-line rider, very short rider that I want to talk about is the licensee disclosure of personal interest. Very basic, very self-explanatory. Either agent sign or can fill this out. It says they have an active or inactive real estate license and have a personal interest in the property. Specify if licensee is related to the party or acting as the buyer or seller. So if you're acting as the agent and also as the buyer or seller, or mom a buyer or seller, or dad a buyer or seller, or whatever it might be, disclose it. I don't know that anybody would not accept a contract because there's a licensing disclosure attached to it. So it does no harm in putting it on there.
And let me just say that keep a short window on these attorney approvals. These attorneys get, no, I'm just kidding. We've had a situation, it says here, this attorney can disapprove the contract. There's no parameters by which the attorney has to follow. So we had a situation where the seller got another offer and it was a better offer. And they had an attorney review, seller had an attorney review. So guess what that seller's attorney did? They disapproved the contract. Okay, and the seller went on and sold it to the second buyer. So just keep the window short. They're the exceptions, with all these things, there's always possibilities. And
What's short, David?
3 days.
I would say, the ones I see are normally 3 days.
3 days.
3 to 5 days at most.
Too long.
Well, if you're on a Monday, maybe you cut it to 2, but if you're on Friday, they're not going to work on the weekend.
Say, what do you have on your plate? How much time do you need? They might say, look, I have all afternoon. Give me a day.
Give them a day. Yeah, absolutely.
Builders would allow this?
No.
No, because they're not going to let you change it anyway. So it doesn't matter whether the attorney
Right.
reviews it. And then the licensee interest, I always tell people, just write that into paragraph 12 or 20 instead of adding a separate piece of paper. Double D, DD, seasonal vacation rentals. You'll notice that if you look at the contract in paragraph 6B, the 6B used to only address rentals as annual rentals. It now addresses in 6B seasonal vacation, short-term rentals. We added that in the last version of the contract, and when we did, we added this rider. This rider gives direction because, wouldn't you agree, we have a lot of properties here that are bought for VRBO, Airbnb purposes these days. So if the seller is currently short-term vacation rental it and the buyer wants to continue it, then what this rider does, it gives the authority to the seller to continue with bookings. But you'll notice we specifically put in here at market rate because we didn't want to give the seller carte blanche authority to continue bookings and they go, oh, well, Uncle Louie wants to come down. I'm going to book it with Uncle Louie for half the price. It's got to be at market rates. It also says, can the seller continue to do bookings with the buyer's approval or without the buyer's approval? So does the buyer say, well, yeah, keep booking it, but I want to know each one and what the dates are? Now, there's good reason why you could go either way on this. A buyer may be buying a property to continue the seasonal rentals, but they look at it and go, wait, they're way below market. I can go in and put a new kitchen and a new bath, tweak those things, jack the rates up. So they don't want the seller to continue bookings, okay? They want to stop. They'll honor whatever bookings are on, but they don't want them to keep booking. Or if the property's in great shape and the market rates are good, then the buyer wants to assume or buy the property with a long history of bookings. So they want the seller to keep booking. So this rider gives the ability to decide what right does the seller have. The second part of it is we're protecting property managers. Because if they're using a property manager to do these seasonal bookings, then this says, and this survives closing, that they will continue for as long as the bookings are on the books to honor that property management agreement and obviously pay that property manager for the bookings that they have put on the books. So we covered both of them in this.
So David, sorry, they must honor
They
any
must.
leases or agreements that are in place.
Yes.
No matter how long, how far forward that goes.
Yeah, that's why if you look at paragraph 6B in the contract, the buyer has the right to receive copies of existing leases because they have to honor them. And if they're different than what was represented, then they have a right to cancel. Now, in here, under A, the last paragraph, the seller is now on these new bookings has to provide copies of those bookings because at the time of the effective date, they had to provide copies of all the bookings that were already of record. Now these have been added after the effective date, so they need to give copies of these, and that provision is covered here.
Okay, thank you.
So if you're buying investment property and you want them to be done, I
Yep.
check box too. Basically, the seller has no control. If I just want to do all new contracts, all new rental rates.
You don't have to use this rider at all to give them any rights at all. This rider gives the seller the right to continue booking with approval or without approval. So if you don't want them to book anymore, what's of record as of the time of the effective date, they have to give you copies of that, and then they're done. This is
For the seller.
Well, it's for the buyer too, because if the buyer wants the seller to continue booking, because when I go to closing, I want as many bookings as possible. That's cash flow for me. So I don't want the seller to stop. If I got a 60-day closing, I want the seller to keep booking. I want them of record. But if I want to renovate it, I want them to stop.
So what happens after the 60 days? They're done.
You close,
You close and then.
and the buyer owns it now.
Right.
Keep that revenue.
The buyer.
Oh,
Yeah.
now that's.
The buyer has to honor them. There's some logistical issues there that need to be dealt with, but that's. All right, we got one last.
Last one, I'll make it quick. PACE programs, PACE loans. PACE programs provide financing for certain home improvements. And it's all part of energy efficiency. So a lot of times you'll see them with maybe solar panels, windows, air conditioning. But instead of having a mortgage for the amount in a loan or any type of lump sum payment, gets built into your property tax bill every year. And so you continually pay it similar to a CDD. So it's usually a 20-year kind of payoff and you pay it over time. The problem with PACE loans is that number one, although they may say they're assumable, they also have like super lien priority like taxes. So if you're a buyer and you're getting a loan, your lender is not going to want to take subject to this PACE loan typically, and they don't really understand what they are. And so they will require that it gets paid off in full. Even if you do have a cash buyer, payoffs are very hard to get on PACE loans. Because of the timing, because there's different lenders out there, they're not all very familiar with closing processes, takes a long time. So try not to schedule a very short closing. I would say if you have a PACE loan on a property, either have your seller try and get some of the information up front, meaning finding out how to request a payoff and maybe even going ahead and requesting the payoff, or have a 30-day closing at least. They're, like I said, they're very complicated, and you know, with a lender, when a lender's involved, they're gonna have to pay it off in full. If it's a cash buyer, again, you can assume it. They can pay it over time, just like the seller was paying it over time. But you need to get payoffs, you need to do prorations, just something for you to be aware of.
So let me just add that the discussion when we created this rider, we almost put language in here that made it a requirement for the PACE loan to be paid off. We backed off on that and we did not put that in there because on a cash buyer, the cash buyer may be willing to assume it. But here's the thing that's at issue. The PACE loan was used to add improvements to the property. Let's say they put a new roof on and new windows. The buyer, when they buy that house, are they paying more for that house because it's got a new roof and new windows? Shake your heads, yes, because they are. They're paying more for the house because of those improvements. So now why should they assume the PACE loan and pay for them again? They shouldn't. They should always pay off a PACE loan, even though that it's not in here. You're not going to convey the property without satisfying it or assuming it, and a cash buyer should never assume it, and a finance buyer can't assume it because, as Amy explained, they new loan won't subordinate.
And typically, like I said, they are going to be listed in, on the property tax bill as a non-ad valorem tax. But the timing sometimes is a little off. So if you get a PACE loan prior to July 1st of a year, it might not show up on that year's tax bill. So it might not be, there might be no record of it until you do a title search, then someone finds it, and then it becomes a problem for everybody. So always ask your sellers, if they have any type of PACE financing.
And before I take that question, one other thing I want to say, the last sentence here, you are encouraged to contact the county property appraiser's office to learn more about this and other assessments that may be provided by law. I talked to Bill first about this and he goes, we don't have any information on PACE. Don't contact us. So Bill is saying, don't contact the property appraisers. We're probably going to need to get this sentence removed because they don't deal with PACE. The tax collector has it in the non-ad valorems. But there are questions in seller's disclosures. Sellers are supposed to disclose if there's a PACE loan. Sometimes they don't know it's called a PACE loan. They don't know it by property assessed clean energy loan. They just know that the contractor that put the roof on said, sign this and I'll get it put in your taxes. But if it's in their taxes, it's a PACE loan, and leave yourself plenty of time.
Check the building permits, right?
Building permits are just going to be pulled by the contractor. It won't necessarily indicate if it's a PACE loan.
Like how you pay for it.
You'll
right?
know something happened there.
Well, you'll know,
Yeah,
but
some work was done. You just don't know how it was paid or if it was paid.
most improvements. Oh, we have a question online.
Can the seller pay off the PACE loan at closing using proceeds from the sale?
Yes,
Yes.
just like any other mortgage loan, they can pay it off in full.
Yeah, and they're a nightmare. So, the Florida legislature is looking into things too on these PACE loans. But
If the sale proceeds are.
Same as if there was a mortgage, it would, at that point become somewhat like a short sale, right? The seller has to come out of pocket and pay it off.
is that it? Any final thoughts, Amy?
I think we got it. Good.
We did it.
Only
Hey,
over.
I applaud you for staying the extra half hour, but hopefully you found it to be worthwhile and learned something about the riders. We have a drawing. We got a raffle drawing.
Jennifer Putnam, Meredith Van Bell, with our Lynn Bondanda, Sarah Wachio, and Bill Trader.
All right.
People.
If you won, go get it. Thanks for being here. We'll hang out, answer questions. So come on up.
Yeah. And, I'll say like. Even like CBD, another. It won't always freeze. However, these items just
Yeah, I wish you asked that question.
I
I
would like
meant
to
to
bring-
say.
Oh, let me give you a card.
The contract pick out.
I
the
was
place, but
you know-
right to keep it active in the ML.
Yeah.
Something walked by.
That's